Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. In the heart of bustling Montreal, nestled between two unassuming brownstone buildings, stood a library made entirely of glass. Its walls shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting the vibrant colors of the city. The locals called it La Bibliothèque de Verre. Some whispered it was a place of magic, where stories leapt off the pages, and wishes hidden in books came true. Arjun wandered its aisles on a cloudy afternoon, the weight of his medical textbooks still pressing on his shoulders. A first-year student at McGill, he often sought solace in this quiet, enchanting corner of the city. But today, the library was different. The air seemed to hum with energy, and every step he took echoed as if the walls were amplifying his presence. He paused in the romance section, not because he sought tales of love, but because it was the quietest spot. As he scanned the spines of the books, his fingers brushed against one that felt warm to the touch. Intrigued, he pulled it out. Eclipsed Hearts. Its cover was plain, except for a single golden crescent moon embossed in the center. Before he could open it, a voice startled him. "Are you sure you're ready for that one?" He turned to see a girl perched on a ladder, balancing precariously as she shelved books. She was dressed in a turtleneck and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her name tag read, Daya. "Why wouldn't I be?" he replied, half defensive, half amused. Dia slid down the ladder with an effortless grace that belied the danger of her perch. "That book has a reputation," she said, her eyes twinkling. "People who read it often end up living the story." Arjun raised an eyebrow. "Living the story? That's ridiculous." She shrugged, her smile widening. "Suit yourself, but if your life gets a little complicated after this, don't say I didn't warn you." Intrigued by her cryptic remark, Arjun flipped the book open. The first page was blank, except for a handwritten note in flowing script. "Love doesn't find you. You find love when you stop running from yourself." "Cryptic much?" he muttered, but Dia had already disappeared among the shelves. Over the next few days, Arjun couldn't stop thinking about the book or Dia. The text inside was captivating, a tale of two strangers brought together by fate and torn apart by choices. But what was stranger still was how familiar the story felt. The main character shared his quirks, his doubts, even his habit of tapping his pen 3 times when thinking. And then there were the coincidences. The coffee shop described in Chapter 4 was the same one Arjun frequented. The stranger the protagonist bumped into on a rainy evening had the same piercing gaze as Dia. By the time he reached Chapter 10, he was spooked. It wasn't just his life the book was describing. It was predicting his future. One evening, he confronted Dia in the library. "Did you write this?" he demanded, waving the book at her. She looked up from her desk, her expression unreadable. "What makes you think I did?" "Because it's about me," he insisted. "Every detail, every thought. It's my life." Dia leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Maybe the book isn't about you," she said softly. "Maybe it's trying to show you something." Arjun frowned. "Show me what?" "That love is less about finding someone and more about finding yourself." Over the next few weeks, the book's narrative began to change. The protagonist stopped chasing shadows and started confronting his fears. He pursued his passions with new determination. And in the story's climax, he realized that love had been beside him all along, in the form of a girl who challenged him, intrigued him, and saw through his defenses. The morning Arjun finished the book, he found a handwritten note slipped between the pages. "You stopped running. Now come find me." The ending was as unexpected as it was bittersweet. When Arjun returned to the library, it was gone. The entire building had vanished, leaving behind an empty lot where wildflowers grew in defiance of the urban sprawl. He searched for Dia, for Eclipsed Hearts, but both had disappeared like a fleeting dream. Years later, when he told the story, some believed him, others didn't. But Arjun knew one thing for certain. Love had found him in the unlikeliest of places and changed him forever. And sometimes that was enough. Chapter 2. The Whisper of Wildflowers. The empty lot where the library had stood became Arjun's obsession. He visited it often, hoping for answers, though he wasn't sure what he was searching for. Dia, the glass library, or a sign that it all hadn't been a figment of his imagination. Each time he came, he found something different. Wildflowers grew in chaotic bursts, their colors changing with the seasons. In spring, soft purples and yellows dotted the field. By late summer, fiery reds and oranges took their place. But one thing remained constant: the strange serenity of the place. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Arjun stood at the edge of the lot, staring into its depths. He had just aced his anatomy exam, but instead of feeling accomplished, he felt hollow. The book's lesson, to find himself, had left him with more questions than answers. As he turned to leave, a voice stopped him. "You still come here?" Arjun spun around. Dia stood a few feet away, dressed in the same turtleneck and jeans, her hair now loose and catching the sunlight. She held a bouquet of wildflowers, their stems tied with a simple ribbon. "Dia?" His voice cracked, disbelief and relief mingling. She smiled, tilting her head. "You didn't give up. Most people do. I thought you were gone. The library, it's gone." Dia stepped closer, her eyes scanning the lot. "The library was never meant to stay. It appears for those who need it and disappears when they've found their path." Arjun's brow furrowed. "But I haven't found anything. I'm more lost now than I was before." She laughed softly, the sound like wind through the flowers. "You've found more than you think. You've stopped living for expectations. You're here, aren't you? Still searching, still curious." Her words struck a chord, but he shook his head. "That's not enough. I don't understand why this happened to me. Why you?" Dia hesitated, then handed him the bouquet. "Because you were ready. Ready to stop running, ready to see the world for what it is, a place full of magic, if you let it be." He took the flowers, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's up to you," she said. "But remember, Arjun, love isn't always a person. Sometimes it's a moment, a place, or even a part of yourself you didn't know you'd lost." The next morning, Arjun woke with the bouquet still on his desk. The flowers were fresh, their scent filling the room. But when he returned to the lot later that day, Dia was gone again. He stopped looking for her after that. Not because he didn't want to see her, but because he finally understood. The library, the book, Dia, they weren't puzzles to solve. They were gifts, reminders that life was fleeting and beautiful, meant to be lived fully and authentically. Years passed. Arjun graduated, became a doctor, and moved to a quiet suburb where he planted a garden filled with wildflowers. He still thought of Dia, especially on days when the wind carried the faint scent of the blooms. One day, while tending his garden, he found a book lying among the flowers. Its cover was plain, with a golden crescent moon embossed in the center. As he opened it, a familiar handwritten note greeted him. "Love doesn't find you. You find love, when you stop running from yourself." And underneath, a new line had been added. "You found it. Now share it." Arjun closed the book, smiling. He looked out over the garden, the flowers swaying in the breeze, and for the first time in years, he felt at peace. The glass library had given him more than answers. It had given him a story he was still living, still writing, one day at a time. Chapter 3: The Keeper of Stories. The garden became Arjun's sanctuary. After long days at the hospital, he found solace among the wildflowers, their colors and scents a constant reminder of his journey. But life, like love, was rarely static. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and lavender, an unexpected visitor appeared. A young girl, no older than 10, stood at the edge of the garden. Her dark hair was tied in 2 braids, and she clutched a worn notebook to her chest. She seemed hesitant, her wide eyes darting between Arjun and the flowers. "Can I help you?" Arjun asked, setting down his watering can. She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on the blooms. "Are you the one who wrote the stories?" He frowned. "Stories?" She nodded, and held up her notebook. Its pages were filled with careful, looping handwriting. On the first page, he saw the title, Eclipsed Hearts. Arjun's breath caught. "Where did you get this?" "The library," she said matter-of-factly. "It appeared a few weeks ago in the park. Everyone says it's magical. I found this book there, and it's about me." The weight of her words sank in. The glass library hadn't vanished. It had simply moved on, finding someone else who needed its magic. The girl hesitated, then asked, "You're the doctor from the story, aren't you?" I... I suppose I am, Arjun said, kneeling to meet her gaze. What's your name? Asha, she replied. The book says I'm supposed to find the Keeper of Stories. That's you, isn't it? Arjun didn't know how to respond. He had never thought of himself as a keeper of anything, let alone stories. But the look in Asha's eyes was unwavering, filled with trust and hope. What does your story say? He asked gently. She flipped to a later chapter. It says I'll meet someone who understands what it's like to be lost, someone who can help me find my way. Over the weeks that followed, Asha became a regular visitor. She would sit in the garden, scribbling in her notebook while Arjun tended to the flowers. She rarely spoke of her past, but her silences spoke volumes. She was searching for something, family, belonging, or perhaps just a sense of home. One evening, as they watched the stars blink into existence, she asked, "Do you think the library is real magic?" Arjun smiled. "I think it's as real as we believe it to be. It shows up when we need it, but it doesn't give us answers. It helps us ask the right questions." Like what? Like who we want to be, what we're afraid of, who we love. Asha was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I was afraid of being forgotten. That's why I wrote everything down, so someone would know I was here." "You won't be forgotten," Arjun said firmly. "Not while I'm here, and not while you keep writing your story." One day, as autumn turned to winter, Asha handed him her notebook. "I want you to have this." "Why?" "Because my story is about finding you, and now that I have, I think it's time to start a new one." Arjun opened the notebook, flipping through its pages. It was filled with tales of resilience, loss, and quiet bravery, but on the last page she had written a single line: "Every story needs an ending, so a new one can begin." That winter, Asha left to live with distant relatives, her laughter and presence leaving an unfillable void in the garden. But she continued to write, sending Arjun letters filled with sketches of her new adventures. Each letter reminded him of the library's gift, not just love, but the courage to share it. Years later, on a summer morning, Arjun woke to find a new book lying among the flowers. Its cover was different this time, a golden sun embossed in the center. He opened it to the first page and read the dedication, "To the Keeper of Stories, who helped me write my own." It was signed, Asha. Tears welled in his eyes as he turned the pages. Her words painted a vivid picture of her journey, her fears, her triumphs, her dreams, and in every chapter there was a hint of him, the doctor who had taught her the power of stories. Arjun closed the book and placed it on his shelf, right next to Eclipsed Hearts. The library's magic had found him once, and now it had passed through him to someone else. As the wildflowers swayed in the morning breeze, Arjun smiled, knowing that his story, too, was far from over. Chapter 4: The Return of the Glass Library. The garden had become more than a sanctuary. It was a symbol of everything Arjun had learned and shared. Patients, neighbors, and friends often visited, seeking solace among the wildflowers. It seemed that everyone had a story to tell, and somehow the garden gave them the space to do so. One late autumn evening, Arjun sat by the window, sipping tea as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. Asha's book lay open on the table beside him, its pages well-worn from countless readings. He thought about her often, imagining the life she was building with the same quiet resilience she had shown in his garden. As he stared out at the snow-dusted flowers, a strange glimmer caught his eye. At first, he thought it was the reflection of moonlight, but as he stepped outside, his breath fogging in the crisp air, he realized it wasn't a trick of light. The library was back. It stood in the middle of the lot, exactly as he remembered it. Its glass walls shimmered like diamonds, and a soft glow emanated from within. For a moment, Arjun simply stood there, stunned. Then, with a deep breath, he pushed open the familiar door. The air inside was warm, humming with the faint sound of whispers. Shelves stretched infinitely in every direction, filled with books of every size and color. But something was different. The library felt alive, as if it were waiting for him. A single book lay open on a table in the center of the room. Its pages were blank except for one line, written in the same elegant script he had first seen years ago. "The Keeper's journey is not yet complete." Before Arjun could process the words, a voice spoke behind him. "I told you we'd meet again." He turned to see Dia, looking exactly as she had the first time he'd met her. Her smile was the same, mischievous, knowing, and impossibly warm. "Dia," he whispered. "How? Why are you here?" She stepped closer, her gaze fixed on him. "The library has always been a guide, Arjun. For you, for Asha, for everyone it touches. But sometimes even the guide needs a keeper." "I don't understand," he said, though deep down he felt he did. She gestured to the shelves. "Every book here is a life, a story waiting to be lived, shared, or remembered. And the library? It's yours now." "Mine?" Dia nodded. "You've spent years helping others tell their stories. You've learned what it means to find love, not just in people, but in moments, in growth, in connection. The library chose you because it trusts you to carry its magic forward." Arjun's heart raced. "But I'm just me. How can I take care of something like this?" Dia placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "You don't have to do it alone. The library will show you what to do, and when the time comes, it will find the next keeper." He looked around, overwhelmed yet oddly calm. "What about you?" "I was only ever a part of your story," she said, her smile bittersweet. "And now it's time for me to go, but I'll always be a part of this place, just as you will." For what felt like hours, Arjun wandered the library, exploring its endless aisles. He found books he recognized, Asha's story his own, and countless others he didn't. Some were unfinished, their pages waiting to be filled. Others glowed faintly, as if their tales were still unfolding. When he finally stepped outside, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft pinks and golds. The library remained, its glass walls sparkling in the morning light. But this time he felt no fear of it disappearing. Months passed, and the garden transformed into a haven for those seeking more than just flowers. People came from all over, drawn by whispers of the glass library and the man who kept its stories. Arjun listened to them all, guiding each visitor to a book that seemed made for them. One day, as he returned from tending the wildflowers, he found a note pinned to the library's door. "Thank you for keeping the stories alive." It was unsigned, but he knew who had written it. With a deep breath, Arjun stepped inside, ready to begin a new chapter, not just for himself, but for everyone who would walk through the library's doors. The keeper of stories had found his place, and the library, ever alive, would continue its journey through him, whispering its magic to those who dared to believe. Final chapter, the eternal story. Years flowed by like pages turning in a well-loved book. Arjun's life became entwined with the library, its magic a steady rhythm that guided him and all who entered. The once empty lot flourished into a place of wonder. Wildflowers framed the glass structure, and lanterns strung through the garden lit the nights with a warm, golden glow. People came not just to read, but to reflect, to heal, and sometimes to leave parts of themselves behind. Through it all, the library never ceased to amaze. Its shelves grew, its whispers grew louder, and its books continued to evolve. Some volumes glowed when touched, their stories eager to be read. Others waited in silence, their covers daring visitors to uncover their mysteries. One winter evening, Arjun sat at his usual desk in the center of the library. Snow fell softly against the glass walls, and the room was filled with a gentle hum as visitors moved through the aisles. In front of him lay a book he had avoided for years, Eclipsed Hearts. It had been years since Dia's words first sparked his journey. Though he had read the book's story countless times, the final chapter had always remained blank. Tonight, however, something compelled him to open it once more. As he turned to the last page, he found words where there had been none before. Every story needs a keeper. Every keeper needs to write their own ending. The pen he had left on the desk lifted gently into the air, as if carried by an invisible hand. It hovered over the blank page, waiting. Arjun hesitated, memories of his journey flashing through his mind. The first time he'd met Dia, the warmth of Asha's laughter, the countless lives he had touched through the library. Slowly he reached out, taking the pen in his hand. He wrote of love, not just romantic love, but the kind that lives in friendships, in fleeting moments, and in the connections that tie strangers together. He wrote of loss and how it shapes people, carving space for growth and understanding. He wrote of magic, not the kind found in fairy tales, but the magic that exists in courage, kindness, and the stories that make life worth living. When he finished, the ink glowed softly before fading into the page. The book snapped shut, and the whispers of the library stilled. For the first time in years, silence filled the space. Then the library itself began to change. The shelves shimmered, their edges blurring like watercolors bleeding into each other. The books floated from their places, spiraling upward toward the glass ceiling in a cascade of color and light. Arjun stood, watching in awe. He didn't feel fear, only a deep sense of peace. The library's magic was shifting, its purpose fulfilled. The books gathered into a single, glowing orb at the center of the room. It pulsed once, then twice, before slowly descending into Arjun's hands. When the light faded, the library was gone. Arjun stood alone in the snowy lot, the orb of light still warm in his hands. He held it close, understanding without words that it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The library's magic was now a part of him, not confined to a building, but carried within his heart. In the years that followed, Arjun became more than a doctor or a keeper of stories. He became a storyteller, traveling far and wide, sharing the lessons the library had taught him. His words inspired others to look inward, to find the magic in their own lives, and to write their own endings. And wherever he went, wildflowers grew in his wake, vibrant and untamed, marking the places where stories had been shared and lives had been touched. One day, in a quiet town, much like where his journey had begun, a young child found a field of wildflowers. At its center stood a single shimmering book, its cover embossed with a golden crescent moon. As the child picked it up, the whispers began. Chapter 1. The Train to Elsewhere. The platform at Grand Central Station was alive with its usual symphony of chaos. Suitcases wheeling, voices overlapping in a cacophony of hellos and goodbyes, and the metallic groan of trains preparing for departure. Among the throng of travelers stood Mira, her crimson scarf a vivid contrast to the muted tones of the late autumn afternoon. She clutched a worn leather journal, its pages thick with ink and pressed flowers, as if it were a talisman. Mira wasn't a believer in chance. Her life was meticulously planned, every decision weighed and measured. But today felt different. The journal in her hands wasn't hers. She'd found it in a cafe 2 weeks ago, abandoned on a wooden table near the window. The name scrawled on the first page was simply Elliot, accompanied by a line of poetry. We meet not by chance, but by design. She hadn't meant to read it, but the words had drawn her in. Elliot wrote about places she'd never been, but felt she somehow knew. Narrow streets glowing with lantern light, windswept cliffs that seemed to hum with ancient songs, and bustling cities where strangers crossed paths and exchanged glances like secret messages. The entries were part travelogue, part soul-bearing confessions, and she felt like she was peering into a life both foreign and strangely familiar. The last entry was a riddle, signed with an invitation. To the keeper of this journal, if fate allows, meet me on the 3:15 train to Elsewhere. Platform 7, Grand Central Station, November 4th. Mira wasn't the type to indulge in romantic whims, yet here she was, staring at the looming steel beast labeled Elsewhere, wondering if Elliot even existed, or if this was some elaborate prank. "Are you coming aboard?" a voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned and found herself face to face with a man who looked like he'd stepped out of one of Elliot's poetic descriptions. He was tall, with a casual elegance, disheveled dark hair, a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, and eyes that glinted like polished obsidian. He gestured toward the train door with a smile that seemed to say he knew all her secrets. Mira hesitated. "I'm not sure," she admitted, clutching the journal tighter. "Well, if you're looking for an adventure, this is the train to take," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. She climbed aboard before she could second-guess herself. The train was unlike any Mira had ever seen. The interior was warm and inviting, with plush seats upholstered in deep green velvet. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their light casting intricate patterns across the walls. The scent of aged wood and fresh tea filled the air. It was as if she'd stepped into another era, one far removed from the sterile modernity of her daily life. As the train lurched forward, Mira found herself seated across from the mysterious stranger. "So," he began, setting his satchel on the floor, "what brings you to Elsewhere?" Mira held up the journal. "I think I'm supposed to meet someone." His smile widened, and for a moment she felt as though he knew something she didn't. "Elliot," he said, almost as a statement rather than a question. Her heart skipped. "How do you—" "Let's just say I'm familiar with the story." Before she could press further, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the 315 to Elsewhere. Please enjoy the journey and prepare for the unexpected." The man leaned back in his seat, watching her with an expression that was both curious and amused. "You don't seem like the type to follow riddles onto strange trains." "I'm not," Mira admitted, "but this felt different." He nodded knowingly. "Things that matter often do." Hours passed, though the landscape outside remained an enigma. Rolling fields that shimmered like liquid gold, forests where the trees seemed to whisper secrets, and distant mountains that seemed to float on the horizon. Mira felt as though she were slipping between the cracks of reality. She and the stranger, who introduced himself as Leo, talked in fragments, their conversation as fluid as the scenery. He told her stories of faraway places, some of which sounded eerily similar to the ones in Elliot's journal. "Have you been to all these places?" Mira asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Leo only smiled. "I've been to enough." As the train slowed to a halt at a station shrouded in mist, Mira felt a strange pull in her chest. "Is this Elsewhere?" Leo stood, offering her his hand. "Come and see." The platform was empty except for a single figure standing beneath a flickering lamppost. Mira's heart raced as she approached, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The figure turned, and her breath caught. It was her. Not a reflection, not a twin, but her. She stared into the face she saw every morning in the mirror. Only this version of herself was older, her eyes sharper, wiser, yet haunted by something Mira couldn't name. "I've been waiting for you," the older Mira said, her voice like the rustle of autumn leaves. "What is this?" Mira whispered, her mind reeling. "This," Leo said from behind her, "is where your story begins." And before she could respond, the world dissolved into light. When Mira woke, she was back at the cafe where she'd found the journal. The crimson scarf was still around her neck, the journal still in her hands, but the last page was blank, save for one line. "We meet not by chance, but by design." Her reflection in the cafe window caught her eye. Her face looked the same, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, as if a part of her had traveled somewhere she could never explain. And in the distance, the faint whistle of a train echoed through the city. Chapter 2. Echoes of Elsewhere. The cafe's hum of life had resumed around Mira, but it felt distant, muffled, like she was underwater. The journal lay on the table in front of her, its presence an enigma she couldn't ignore. The blank final page taunted her, demanding answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. She glanced out the window. The city was still the same. Bustling streets, pedestrians glued to their phones, the dull gray sky heavy with impending rain. And yet it all felt slightly off, as if the edges of reality had blurred. The waiter interrupted her thoughts. "Miss, would you like another coffee?" "No, thank you," Mira replied automatically, her fingers brushing the journal's cover. She hesitated before asking, "Do you remember who was sitting here before me 2 weeks ago? The person who left this journal?" The waiter frowned, tapping a pen against his chin. "I can't say I do. We get a lot of people in here. Sorry." Mira nodded. Disappointed but not surprised, she slid the journal into her bag, threw on her coat, and left the cafe. The walk home was uneventful, though her senses felt heightened. The chatter of passers-by seemed louder, the smell of damp pavement sharper, and the flickering neon signs of the shops more vivid than usual. She shook her head, telling herself it was just adrenaline. When she reached her apartment, the first thing she did was pull out the journal again. She flipped through its pages, rereading Elliot's entries, searching for something she might have missed. Halfway through, she found it. A pressed flower, delicate and blue, slipped from between the pages. It wasn't there before. She was certain of it. Mira picked it up carefully, holding it up to the light. The petals shimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if they were catching sunlight that wasn't there. A single word was scrawled on the page where the flower had been tucked. "Tomorrow." Her pulse quickened. "Tomorrow what?" she murmured aloud. No answer came, but she couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was waiting for her. The next day dawned gray and cold, with a sharp wind that cut through Mira's coat as she walked to her office. She couldn't focus on work. Her mind kept drifting back to the journal, to the flower, to the train. During her lunch break, she found herself wandering aimlessly through the city. Her feet seemed to move on their own, carrying her past familiar streets, until she arrived at a park she didn't remember ever visiting. It was quiet, almost eerily so. The bare branches of the trees creaked in the wind, and the only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel path. At the center of the park was a small, ornate fountain, and sitting on its edge was Leo. "You're late," he said, standing as she approached. "What? How?" Mira stammered, her breath visible in the cold air. "What are you doing here?" "Waiting for you," he said simply. His leather satchel was slung over his shoulder again, and he looked as relaxed as if they'd planned this meeting weeks ago. "This doesn't make any sense," she said, shaking her head. "I thought that it was a dream," he interrupted, his dark eyes gleaming. "That you'd imagined it? You didn't." She folded her arms, her voice sharp with skepticism. "Then explain what's happening to me. Who are you? And who is Elliot?" Leo's smile softened. "Elliot is you, Mira." The words struck her like a blow. "What are you talking about? That's not my name." "Not yet," he said cryptically. Mira opened her mouth to protest, but he held up a hand. "I know this is overwhelming, but think about it. The journal, the train, the older version of yourself. You were meant to find that book. You were meant to take that journey." "But why?" she demanded. Leo stepped closer, his expression serious now. "Because there's something you need to remember. Something you need to become. And it starts with trust." "I don't even know you," Mira said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Not yet," he repeated, a faint smile playing on his lips. Leo led her away from the fountain and into the heart of the park. The path twisted and turned, and Mira felt as though they were walking much farther than the park should allow. Eventually, they came to a clearing where a single tree stood. Its branches were bare, but its bark shimmered with the same faint light as the petals of the flower she'd found. Leo gestured for her to approach. "Touch it," he said. Mira hesitated, but finally reached out. The moment her fingertips brushed the bark, a wave of warmth surged through her. Images flooded her mind, glimpses of the places Elliot had described in the journal, flashes of faces she didn't recognize but felt she should know. And then a voice, soft but insistent, echoed in her mind. "The choice is yours, Mira. Stay and forget, or go and become." She pulled her hand back, breathing hard. "What was that?" "The tree shows you possibilities," Leo said. "It's a doorway, Mira, one that only you can open." "To what?" she whispered. "To elsewhere," he said. "To your true self." Mira stared at the tree, her heart pounding. She didn't understand all of it, not yet, but she felt the pull deep in her bones. She turned to Leo. "If I go, will I find answers?" "You'll find more than that," he said. "You'll find yourself." Taking a deep breath, Mira placed her hand on the tree again. The light enveloped her, and this time she didn't resist. And as the world dissolved around her, she realized she wasn't afraid. Chapter 3. The Path Unseen. When the light faded, Mira found herself standing in a place that defied logic. The air shimmered with hues she couldn't name, the sky stretched endlessly, neither day nor night, and the ground beneath her feet felt both solid and fluid, as if it responded to her presence. Ahead of her was a path, a thin ribbon of gold winding into the horizon, flanked by fields of tall, translucent grass that hummed softly when the wind stirred them. The tree was gone, as was Leo. She was alone. Or so she thought. "Welcome, Mira." She spun around to find her older self standing there, the same sharp eyes and haunted expression that had greeted her beneath the lamppost at the station. This time, however, there was no flickering light or misty veil. The older Mira looked more tangible, her presence almost commanding. "What is this place?" Mira asked, her voice trembling. "This," her older self said, gesturing to the endless expanse, "is the in-between. A world built from choices, from echoes of what was and what could be. It's where you'll decide what comes next." Mira's brow furrowed. "Decide? Decide what?" Her older self stepped closer, studying her with an intensity that made Mira feel naked. "You've seen the journal. You followed the clues. But do you understand what it means?" Mira shook her head. "No. I don't even know why I'm here." The older Mira sighed, her expression softening. You're here because a part of you remembers. The part of you that's been locked away, buried under the weight of routine and doubt. The journal, the train, the tree, they were all ways to awaken you. Awaken me to what? Mira asked, her frustration bubbling to the surface. To the truth of who you are, her older self said simply. The older Mira motioned for her to follow, and they began walking along the golden path. With each step, the world around them shifted. One moment, they were surrounded by towering cliffs that seemed to sing. The next, they were crossing a bridge suspended over a sea of stars. You don't have to take my word for it, the older Mira said after a long silence. You can see for yourself. She stopped and gestured to the side of the path. A pool of water had appeared, its surface as smooth and reflective as glass. Look, her older self said. Mira hesitated but knelt beside the pool, leaning over to peer into its depths. At first, she saw nothing but her own reflection, but then the image shifted, rippling as scenes began to emerge. She saw herself standing in a crowded square, her crimson scarf billowing in the wind. Around her, people moved with purpose, their faces lit with a strange golden glow. Mira's own face was different, though. Calmer, surer, as if she carried a secret no one else could understand. The scene changed. Now she was on a windswept cliff, her hair tangled by the breeze. She was laughing, her voice carried away by the wind, and beside her stood someone she couldn't quite make out. The final image froze her heart. She was back at the tree, only this time it was ablaze with light. She held the journal in her hands, its pages glowing, and her older self stood beside her, whispering words Mira couldn't hear. What is this? Mira whispered, her voice barely audible. Fragments, her older self said. Glimpses of what lies ahead, if you choose to follow the path. And if I don't? The older Mira's expression darkened. Then the path disappears, and the echoes fade. You return to your old life, none the wiser, but always feeling that something is missing. Mira stood, her heart pounding. Why me? Why is this my choice? Her older self smiled faintly. Because you're the only one who can make it. They continued walking until the path ended abruptly at a massive gate. It was unlike anything Mira had ever seen, ornate and otherworldly, its surface etched with swirling patterns that seemed to shift and dance when she looked at them. This is it, her older self said, stepping aside. Beyond this gate lies elsewhere. If you pass through, there's no turning back. Mira hesitated, staring at the gate. She felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her, the enormity of what lay ahead. What will I find on the other side? She asked. Yourself, her older self said, and everything you've been searching for. Mira reached for the gate, her fingers trembling. As she touched its surface, the patterns flared to life, and the gate began to open. A blinding light spilled through the crack, enveloping her in its warmth. And as she stepped through, Mira realized that she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The world on the other side was unlike anything she'd ever imagined. Colors she couldn't name danced in the sky, and the air hummed with an energy that felt alive. She stood on a hill overlooking a vast, shimmering landscape, and in the distance she could see a city that seemed to pulse with light. A voice broke the silence. Took you long enough. She turned to see Leo standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets and that infuriatingly knowing smile on his face. Leo, she said, her voice a mix of relief and exasperation. What is this place? Welcome to Elsewhere, he said. We've been waiting for you. Mira looked out at the endless horizon, the journal still clutched in her hands. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of purpose, of belonging. And as the path stretched out before her, she knew her journey was just beginning. Chapter 4. The Labyrinth of Choices. Mira stood in the heart of Elsewhere, her senses overwhelmed by the vibrancy of the world around her. The air shimmered with colors she had no names for, and the sky above was a cascade of light and shadow, as though it was alive, breathing with the rhythm of the land. Leo stood beside her, watching her with that same enigmatic smile. What is this place? Mira asked again, her voice thick with awe. Leo chuckled softly. I've told you before, Mira. Elsewhere is a reflection. It's where you go when you stop pretending you know where you're headed. Mira looked at him, trying to make sense of his words. So, I'm supposed to find myself here? You've already found yourself, he replied, his tone serious. This place will show you the many versions of yourself. Every choice you've ever made or avoided echoes in the labyrinth of elsewhere. You're meant to walk its paths, but remember, each step you take will lead you to another you. The words echoed in her mind, leaving her feeling more lost than ever. She hadn't even had the time to ask if she was dreaming, or if this world was real. But as she stood there, feeling the soft pull of the land beneath her feet, she knew one thing. This place felt as real as anything she'd ever known. "Come on," Leo said, gesturing toward a narrow path that appeared at their feet, winding through fields of tall, silver grass that swayed in rhythm with an unseen breeze. "Let's take a walk. You'll start understanding when you see it for yourself." Reluctantly, Mira followed, her mind racing. They walked in silence for what seemed like hours, passing through landscapes that seemed to warp and shift as if the earth itself was reacting to their presence. At times, the ground beneath them appeared to ripple like water, and other times, the air was thick with whispers that Mira couldn't quite make out. "Where are we going?" Mira finally asked. "To the labyrinth," Leo answered simply. "The labyrinth?" Mira repeated, her heart skipping a beat. "What's that?" "It's where you'll meet the others," he said, his voice almost casual. "The others?" "You." Leo's eyes flickered with something unreadable. "You'll see what I mean." They arrived at the edge of a vast, jagged cliff, the edges crumbling into nothingness. Beneath them was a deep, swirling mist, the air thick with a strange kind of pressure, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. From the mist rose the entrance to the labyrinth, an enormous gate carved from dark stone, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Mira swallowed. It's a maze." "It's more than that," Leo said, his tone serious now. "It's a trial, a place where your choices will be reflected back at you in ways you won't be able to ignore. There are paths in there, Mira, but none of them are straight." "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "I thought I was here to find myself." "You are," Leo said, "but the labyrinth won't give you any answers. It will give you choices, and how you choose will determine what you become." Mira's heart pounded in her chest. "What if I choose wrong?" Leo turned to face her, his expression softening. "There is no wrong choice, Mira, but there are paths that lead to things you may not be ready for." Before she could ask what he meant, the stone gate groaned and began to open. A cold gust of wind swept past them, sending shivers down Mira's spine. "You ready?" Leo asked, looking at her with an unreadable expression. Mira took a deep breath. "I don't know if I am, but I don't think I have a choice." Leo gave her a half smile. "That's the spirit." They stepped through the gate. The labyrinth was not what Mira expected. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world around them shifted once again, folding into an entirely new landscape. The stone walls rose high above them, stretching into an endless void. The air was thick with the scent of moss and earth, and the path before them was barely visible, veiled by tendrils of mist that seemed to reach out, tugging at her every step. "You'll find your first choice soon enough," Leo said, his voice echoing strangely against the walls. "Where are we going?" Mira asked, glancing around nervously. "You're not going anywhere, Mira," Leo replied, his tone almost distant now. "The labyrinth moves as you move. Your decisions will guide you forward, whether you realize it or not." "Decisions," she repeated, her mind reeling. "What decisions?" "Every turn you make, every feeling you follow." He paused. "Every fear you confront." Before Mira could respond, a soft voice echoed from the shadows ahead of them. "Mira?" She froze. That voice, she knew it. It was her own. "Mira, come here." The voice was filled with longing, a pull she couldn't ignore. Without thinking, Mira started walking toward the sound. "Mira, stop!" Leo's voice rang out, sharp with warning. But she couldn't stop. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It was calling her with an urgency that made her chest tighten. She rounded the corner of the stone path and froze. There, standing in the center of a small, circular clearing, was a figure. A mirror image of herself, but not quite. This version of Mira looked older, her face lined with the wisdom of years she hadn't yet lived. Her eyes were filled with a sorrow Mira couldn't place, but they shone with a quiet power. "Mira," the other her said softly, holding out her hand. "Come with me." Mira's heart thudded in her chest as she stepped forward, drawn to this other version of herself. "Who are you?" "I am you," the older version replied. The you that could have been. Mira's mind spun. What do you mean? How is that possible? This is the choice, the older Mira said gently. The path you didn't take. The life you chose to leave behind. But it's not too late. You can still go back. You can still be the person you were meant to be. Mira's head was spinning. Go back? But I've already made my choice. You haven't, the older Mira replied. You're still in the labyrinth. The choice you make now will shape everything. Mira's gaze darted between Leo and the older version of herself. What am I supposed to do? The older Mira's face softened. You don't need to choose. You need to choose you, the version of yourself you truly want to be. Mira's hands trembled. The path ahead was uncertain, and each step seemed to bring her closer to a version of herself that didn't feel entirely real. And yet, the weight of the decision was real. Too real to ignore. Chapter 5. The Unveiling. The air in the labyrinth grew heavier as Mira stood frozen between the two versions of herself. The older Mira's eyes were filled with a calm certainty, a lifetime of experiences and lessons that had shaped her into someone who had embraced the choices she'd made, no matter how painful. Mira, Leo's voice broke through the tension, sharp and clear. This is your moment. You can't hold on to what could have been. You must choose what will be. The older version of Mira smiled faintly, her expression both understanding and sad. Don't be afraid. This isn't a choice of failure or success. It's simply about who you choose to become. She gestured toward Leo. You don't need us. All you need is yourself. Mira's heart was pounding, her mind swirling. Everything felt impossibly heavy, as though the weight of every decision she had ever made was pressing down on her now. She looked from her older self to Leo, and finally, to the path that lay ahead. Beyond the labyrinth, beyond the place where everything blurred, and everything waited. The whispers from the labyrinth seemed to grow louder, urging her to follow either one of these versions of herself, to seek the safe choice of the life already lived, or to turn back and accept the unfamiliar path ahead. But Mira knew something now. She knew that neither version of herself could define her, not completely. They were parts of her, reflections, but not the sum of who she was. The older version of her represented what could have been, the choices made in the comfort of conformity, but there was a piece of herself she had buried for so long, a part that could not be bound by anyone else's path. She turned away from both of them, her voice shaking but resolute. I'm not you, she said, her gaze meeting the older Mira's. And I'm not the person you want me to be, Leo. I'm me. Leo's expression softened, his gaze full of understanding. The older Mira nodded once, slowly, a gentle approval in her eyes. You've made your choice, Leo said quietly. But remember, this path, your path, will not be easy. It will be full of unknowns. You'll stumble. You'll question. But it will be yours, and only yours. Mira turned her back on the labyrinth, taking a deep breath as she faced the path beyond, now clearer than ever. The air felt lighter, the weight of indecision lifting as she walked forward. As she walked, the landscape around her began to change. The twisted, crumbling walls of the labyrinth faded into nothingness, replaced by fields of wildflowers, their colors more vibrant than anything she had ever seen. The light was softer here, almost as if the very sky was welcoming her into this new world. Leo remained by her side, walking in silence. For the first time since they had met, there was no pressure in the air, no weight of expectation. It was simply the two of them, stepping forward into a future that Mira had chosen, one step at a time. They reached the edge of the field, where the land dropped into a valley that stretched toward a distant mountain range. The air smelled sweet, fresh, a far cry from the heavy, stifling mist of the labyrinth. This is it, Leo said, stopping beside her. This is the world outside of elsewhere. Mira stood still for a moment, taking in the beauty of the land, the freedom of it. She had chosen. She had made her decision, and with it, she had released the fear that had held her back for so long. The version of herself that had wandered through the labyrinth, lost and uncertain, was gone. This was the real Mira. No more mirrors, no more echoes of what could have been. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the valley, and Mira felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The road ahead was unknown, but she was no longer afraid of it. She wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for experiences, for choices that would shape the person she was becoming. Leo turned to face her. "Are you ready?" he asked, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. Mira smiled, feeling a deep, unspoken connection with him. She wasn't sure if their paths would continue to cross, but at that moment, she didn't need to know. She was ready to face the world on her own terms. "I'm ready," she said, her voice clear and full of conviction. With that, they began to walk down the path, the sun dipping below the horizon behind them. Each step Mira took was a declaration of who she was, a promise to herself that she would no longer be bound by anyone else's expectations, but would forge her own way forward. And as the final rays of daylight faded into twilight, Mira realized something. The journey was never about the destination, never about choosing the right path or becoming the person she was meant to be. It was about becoming the person she wanted to be. And that was enough.